You have Suthichai, who founder, the man who runs the nation in Thailand. I have lots of questions for him. Roy Tan from the Malaysian Star, Zaffar Abbas, Dawn from Pakistan, and Ernest Lewis from
Hi.
Singapore, the Straits Times. I'm going to throw questions, but please feel free to ask, and I will throw the first one to Suthichai. This has been an interesting conference throughout. From what you saw of Jeremiah and crowdsourcing itself, how are you factoring this into the way you see journalism moving?
I'm very impressed with the presentations, all the presentation this morning. And this is exactly the kind of thing we are looking at in trying to make journalism, digital journalism, very much part of the crowd. But in our experience, we have to distinguish between crowds and mobs and the communities. And at the moment, in the daily coverage of news, we tend to concentrate on communities. And of course, we use crowd whenever it is necessary and whenever it is practical. But we try to prevent using mobs, especially in very sensitive areas, especially on the ongoing protests in Thailand. If you map the moods of the people, you get an implosion of emotion. And it is very difficult for a newspaper or television in Thailand to really map that kind of mood and report it directly, because that kind of mapping could change from hour to hour. And that is our problem as journalists. Although, as Maria said, we are no more gatekeepers, but we still have to try to keep the gates as open as possible, despite the fact that some people do not have to go through our gates anymore. But we do try to use crowdsourcing to report the changing mood and not really making any judgment on whether the crowd this is the real reflection of the crowd. You throw in another piece of information, the crowd changes. Sometimes it becomes quite violent. Sometimes it becomes very biased. Sometimes it becomes totally unreliable. So the mapping of the mood in presenting to the audience in general would have to be very well scrutinized and analyzed. So I agree totally that we have to go to the crowd, but at the same time, we still need professional judgment in presenting, especially if the stories break every minute and not every hour. As when you were on CNN, it was the hourly break, right? But now it breaks every second. And the most difficult thing for us is how to keep up with the mood of the crowd. I don't know how you handle it, but I think you are monitoring it in a great way. I hope we can use that on television and that the crowd would react and give us feedback that would reflect the changing reality of the situation.
I can share the two with you. Malaysia is fascinating because of everything that's gone on since '97. You're seeing actually all of our countries have this demographic, the youth coming up and pushing change. How do you see crowdsourcing fitting in Malaysia and in the Star?
Well, the first thing is that news, like every other part of, is actually part of a greater subset of content. And content is, in my view, always divided into three things. There is professionally edited content. So in the news context, it's always been journalists So those are the professionals in their space. These are the ones who will verify, fact check every single thing that's being done. The second space is prosumers, those who are part-timers in the field who will aggregate and form opinions. They may not necessarily be experts. And of course, there's the average consumer, which is the third subset. The third subset makes up a large degree of content as well. In fact, in every single content space, there's always this three. And in my opinion, this is what I call the rule of 1/3. There is always a role to play for professionals, prosumers, and consumers. So if you talk about election talk, the average consumer is the guy sitting around in a coffee shop having a political discussion. So there is a role in all three to a decision-making process, and how the crowd evolves and engages with any organization is actually a communication. And whether you call it crowdsourcing or social, it is just an element of it, which today we have the technology to separate and distinguish the elements of it that makes it relevant for us to make key decisions on.
Zaffar, in Pakistan, it has the same problem as India, which was interesting with what Arun was saying about crowdsourcing there. Internet penetration rates are still very low. Is crowdsourcing something that can be effective for you? Is it in your plans at all?
Well, you're spot on. In Pakistan, there is a problem like in India. There are places where you can have power shut down for 12 hours, not to talk about you can have power shut down for 12 hours, not to talk about not having internet, even if the power is there. So there are serious problems. But let me first make a confession over here. When I stepped inside this hall this morning, for the first few minutes, I was trying to understand what was going on and whether I was in the right room. And that largely explains that coming from a country where the nature of the beast is different, where the problems are different, what was being discussed over here is not even being talked about in countries like Pakistan. So yes, tomorrow crowdsourcing may become a major debate, major discussion, but at the moment, it's not there.
Interesting. And then, of course, we have to go to Singapore. What's interesting to me about Singapore is you've got high internet penetration rates, but you also have a society that's used to control.
Yeah, I guess one word to describe Singapore in the last 30 years would be predictable. And then in the last 3-4 years, actually, the words coming out would be unpredictable. That's a word you don't associate with Singapore. And simply because there are seemingly cracks at the seam, be it with infrastructure, with the way the internet is very enabled with the crowd now. Citizen journalism is very strong. Everyone feels like, I think the difference is, you know, if I would say, I mean, about 20 years ago, when I first started taking the public transport system, I used to see the same problems that people post pictures on Facebook now about. Except that 20 years ago, we didn't have Facebook. We would have to write a letter to the Straits Times and then hope that it would be published. And I never saw any of those articles at that time. And yeah, and I'm from the Straits Times. Eventually, I worked for the company a couple of years later. The difference, I think, is the power is in the hands of the people now. At that time, the old traditional media companies, they had they could control the feedback. But now you can go on Facebook, you can go on Twitter. I mean, let's take a look about a few months ago when the Little India riots took place in Singapore. So I was actually coming back from a movie that night, and my staff called me up and said, there's something happening in Little India. And I actually wasn't on duty, but I decided, okay, something needs to be coordinated around here. And we took a look at the footage that was coming on through social media, and then we decided, okay, this definitely looks like a riot. In the meantime, our colleagues were already verifying with the authorities. Now, do you then start a hashtag like #LittleIndiaRiot, you know, without discerning? I mean, those are judgment calls at that point, you figure you do it first. It's not a hashtag that is irresponsible, because I'm totally against those kind of things. So we didn't do things like hashtag Little India riot, so the whole of the country is coming down, let's take it down. You know, we can't do things like that. And yeah, I would say it's changing. And that was one of the clearest examples recently of how we use Twitter to start the story coverage for the Straits Times. And it was just breaking, and it just went manic after that in the next few hours after that. Yeah.
And what's the attitude in the organization now? Because it's new ground. How do you deal with it, gentlemen, any of you?
Okay, say for example, the Straits Times, very old beast actually, old lady actually, since 1845. And I became the social media editor in 2011. I've been in the company for about 19 years actually. So I've done a few roles, but when I was a social media editor in 2011, that coincided with the general elections here. At that time, I could see that there was this move by the government also, especially after the elections, that they were going to use social media as an important tool. And there's no way that Straits Times could just continue on the print way. So part of my role was actually to try and re-educate my colleagues. I had to train them in Twitter, I had to train them in Facebook. Most importantly, I think, right, for any of you guys thinking of doing crowdsourcing, you've got to hire someone who's not afraid of feedback from the public to do this. If you're not going to hire someone to be in charge of your crowdsourcing efforts, and that person is cautious and too afraid, do not even go there yet. Yeah, I would say then it's a mindset change. I'm trying to win over the senior management and tell them, look, we can't just stick our heads in the sand and ignore what's going out there. You've got to slowly open up. You've got to accept that feedback is going to come your way. You've got to accept that criticism of your product is also going to come your way. And that is, I think now they've come, it's taken about like 2 years, but I think everyone is now aware of that, and we're trying to find ways to work together, and the whole newsroom is actually now trying to be integrated on this effort. Yeah.
Maria,
Suthichai.
we started with writing blogs about 10 years ago. And we in the newsroom at the Nation in Bangkok started to tell our reporters, editors, writers to write blogs. And the first reaction was very negative, saying, why do we have to write blogs? We are already very busy. Do you pay us more if you write blogs?
Yeah.
Then came the social media, the Twitter. In fact, my transformation started with digital camera. I don't know whether some of you remember, we were using films to take pictures. And I had to go through that big fight with my photographers when I started telling them that, hey, we don't need film anymore. You can take digital pictures. The first little camera, I think, came from Taiwan. A friend of mine bought one for me, and I was very excited. I had a meeting of all the photographers, and I said, hey, guys, we're going to take pictures digitally, no more films. They took a look at the picture, and they said, Suthichai, this is just a toy. It's not going to work. And in fact, they were right, because the pixels were bad. You couldn't really publish a picture from the original digital camera. 2 years passed by, 3 years passed by, and the pixels got better. Came back to my photographers and showed them. They still said, yeah, maybe 50%, but it's still not something that would be sustainable. Forget it. And I fought with them for about 5-6 years until today. When I talk to them about history, they say, well, it was just an accident that it worked. Now, then the big battle came with social media, Twitter. I told all the reporters that you must go onto Twitter. About 10 of them out of 200 may start tweeting. But you have to work on those who were keen. And you have to start talking loudly in the newsroom. Say, hey, how did your Twitter work? And say, yeah, great, And other guys who were not tweeting would be, looking at one another and started to think they were probably not doing the right thing. Then came Facebook. And now, if I tell my staff that they're not allowed to go on social media, they would start a revolution. They would start overthrowing me, right? So this is part of the process that we started about 10 years ago, to beginning with persuasion, then starting really, in the end, I made it a rule that everyone has to tweet and use Facebook and Twitter as part of the reporting tools. How do you do it, and how do you force them to do it? I make it a KPI in the annual assessment.
Wow.
It's 30% of the assessment scores. So and those who really are busy on social media, it shows the performance is much better. And some of the reporters who were among the first line in the battlefield started to tweet to their sources and say, I have some question. I have no time to see you personally, but I have a few questions. Can I ask you on Twitter? Some of the cabinet members, some of the senior officials and well-known academics were on Twitter then. And the reporters who started to use social media to do their job started to become very, very effective. And they got answers from some of the cabinet members without having to see them face to face. So they started to set the example. And very soon, most of the newsroom people started to use social media. And now it is, I would say, 95%. And those who don't use social media to work, those who don't understand crowdsourcing, are a very small minority at the moment.
I wish you were on the ABS board. It took me 6 months to convince them that we should push our reporters. This was in 2007, so it was a while back. Please, any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'll keep monopolizing them. You can just run up to the mic. I'll throw a question. I need to take it to business model.
I'll give you a very good example that I tried. We had this copyright to translate the book by Walter Isaacson on Steve Jobs.
My ex-boss.
Yeah? And we translated into Thai. So one day the design of the cover came, the Thai version, came to me by email. One of my graphic designers sent it to me. I was on Facebook and Twitter. So I just sent this draft into Twitter and say, hey, what do you think, my followers? Within about an hour or so, I got at least 20 to 30 reactions. And most of them said, no, bad, terrible. Steve Jobs would not approve. Because the design was full of, the company's logo, the translators' names, And out of the 20, 30 reactions I got, about 10 of them said, you must design it as simply as possible. Just follow the original design. That is white background with only the picture of Steve Jobs and Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. That's it. The rest you put on the side. So I sent it back to my graphic designers. And they were not too happy. I said, they don't understand graphic designs. Your followers, are not designers. Believe it or not, I said, I think I believe my crowd. And we used the crowdsourced design. It became a bestseller. And I think this is one good example of a very simple way of just crowdsourcing. This is co-designing. And my graphic designers became very aware of crowdsourcing from then on. Every draft, every design that they started, they would put onto Facebook to test out the reactions. And it becomes a very, very common practice in our office now that You consult the crowd before you make a decision.
Fantastic.
Can
Zaffar.
I just say a little bit about crowdsourcing in journalism? Of course, social media is a reality. Of course, the world is moving towards what is being described as crowdsourcing. But you have worked for television for many, many years. I have spent
BBC?
some years in
Zaffar's former
with
BBC.
BBC and radio and television. And when we work in a country where the news cycle is huge, for instance, take the example of Pakistan. In the morning, if there is a bomb explosion and 30 people killed, by noon probably it will be a fourth or fifth story, and by evening probably it will be off the radar. In that kind of a speedy news cycle, the big challenge is how quickly you can get the real information from the area, from a small district or a small village. But at the same time, how much reliable that information is. And is there a real fear of becoming victim of wrong information, which we become responsible for moving it to our viewers or listeners, or scandalous information or authentic information? And that is where the difference between information coming in and that being turned into real journalism comes in. And that is where our own role comes in, how to vet that information and what information should be passed on to your viewers and readers and listeners. And that makes our own task huge and in some way far more responsible than what it used to be in the past.
Fantastic. I have to ask about our business models. I mean, we've talked about the crowd, have they become part of our organizations, but how is it changing business models? The senior editors from Asia are actually in Singapore now with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation. They are discussing, I'm assuming, the future of journalism. So what business model, what is your ideas in terms of how to incorporate this into existing dying business models?
Well, for one, I don't think it's dying just yet. Well, actually, the reason why I say it's not dying just yet is because if you follow the rules of 1/3, and if you understand the fact that there will always be professional journalism, and you always understand that, the question isn't about whether it's going to exist, the question is what form. We've all been talking about how news editors are changing the way in a social environment. And every news organization is doing it. Every newsroom is literally blasting out socially first, rather than on their publications. In fact, the prioritization queue almost seems social, website. And then after that, we're trying to figure out what the hell are we going to put in a newspaper the next day. So it almost seems to be in that order. So in terms of monetizing it, so if you understand the fact that the 1/3 is that there's always a role of ensuring that the content is edited properly to ensure that's verified, then there's always a role for news organizations. In terms of monetizing it, everyone knows that audience is what drives news. News organizations regenerate audiences every day. Every day, bad example, wouldn't say every day, there will be something that happens. In Malaysia's case recently, we've had an unprecedented event where we had a plane in today's day and age go missing. And the impact on the audiences in our business is insane. And I say it's insane, it's insanely big. We've never seen any numbers like that before. Just to qualify, we had our general election last year, hotly contested, and the numbers that we have for the missing jetliner last month doubles that of general election. So going back to the business models for news organizations are all about monetizing audiences. We traditionally, as news organizations, underwrite their costs through advertising. And even that business model is under a state of change today, where we move from the value of the inventory directly to the value of the audiences. And that's how, when we have a hot news day, the value of the audience are of greater value than the value of the advertising inventory today.
Excellent. Zaffar in Pakistan.
Well, Maria, I've been a reporter and a journalist all my life, so I'll rather listen from people who deal with business,
okay.
because my own challenge is that with new and more innovative features coming into journalism, money from the old-fashioned journalism is going away. So whenever I ask my bosses to give money for a story from a newspaper, they say, "Wait for a moment, we are trying something new in the field." So I'll rather listen to these guys to find out what's
I will
happening.
come to you last.
I think what
Ernest.
Zaffar said is very true, and I think it's not just in the media, but I think it's with commercial companies. The tendency is a lot for us to take an ad out or even write a story and then expect people to just plonk money for that sudden reach, or even plonk money for that one story. And I think in this climate, you've really got to work hard. You've got to shape that story. You've got to have features. You've got to have different social media campaigns. I like what Talent House did with some of the videos. Those are fun. Those are entertaining. Those are presence built modules that you build in a microsite or something like that. And who wouldn't want to be associated with that kind of microsite on a news platform, say, for example. But you've got to differentiate that from the actual hard news stories, because I think right now, from what I see with my marketing colleagues, they've really got to work harder. For every dollar out there on the online sphere, as Roy will tell you, it's very aggressive. You've got to convince that you're not even treating it like an ad in the newspaper. You're treating it more like an ongoing campaign. And that's where actually the journalists or the editors, because of their knowledge of the crowd that's out there, the market that's out there, they are able to then tweak the advertised tweets for that campaign, you see, or the social media marketeers. They have to do that. They have to think that. Now, for the editors, from a editorial point of view, what we did with the Straits Times a few years ago, I mean, myself and one of my editors, we look at the Straits Times and we identified, is there a prime area that we can just dedicate to actual sponsored series or advertorials? You know, now who takes care of the sponsored series or advertorials will then be decided by the team that's working with the advertisers. But what we are pitching then is that this platform reaches how many people? It reaches almost 300,000 people on Facebook and also on Twitter on a daily basis. That's our number of followers. That is the kind of prospect that you are pitching then. Now, I would say then that the money is, I think there's this well-known saying, right? For every $7 you used to get in a print ad, you only get like $1 for online ads or something like that. That's why I said you have to work really hard. Yes, there will come a time when you reach the cliff and then there's a sudden steep. But I've seen like what Rappler does. And they're always on my Twitter feed bombarding it. And I love it because I don't feel like it's spam, but it feels that it takes my eye. And I'm in Singapore. Why would I be interested in the Philippines? But increasingly, because of the way I see my own habits, and it seems to dovetail with other people's habits, like I'm in charge of this site called stcommunities.sg. And I see people from the US interacting with our Twitter feed, telling us, oh, what great stories you guys have. We don't even have that in our country. Now, why are they doing that? For the same reason I'm checking out Rappler. There is not so much of an identification with different news agencies as so much as it is with common interests and passions. And that's actually where you're going to try and monetize it, actually. Yeah.
Agree. Suthichai, the guy on top.
About 30 years ago, when we started doing TV, not our own TV station, but I started with a program in one of the TV stations. My print editor scolded me, saying, if you go on TV with the news that we have in the newsroom, who is going to read the newspaper the next morning? TV was seen as a threat at the time. And when TV had breaking news, hourly breaking news, print editors got very scared, right? Now it's even worse. You can see it as a threat, or you can see it as an opportunity. And if you cannot avoid the threat, you have to see it as an opportunity. And we at the nation have 3 daily newspapers, a radio station, and now we're going to have 2 terrestrial television channels, digital television channels. There's no time for us to feel the threat and to just start worrying every day about whether we'll survive or not. So we have turned this threat into thriving opportunity to cover the news in a way that we have never been able to do. That is, technology enables our reporters to do stories, to be able to cover live stories. You know, you don't even need they call it OB, the outdoor broadcasting truck, which every time you move out to do even a 5-minute story, you need 30 people, and it is very expensive. Now you have what they call live view. It's a backpack thing, you know, and you can go anywhere, and live, the reporter can just talk from there. Or you can Skype, and now you can use Line, you can use WhatsApp, and the quality of videos are good enough to go on TV. So our reporting team is using every possible new technology to cover the story for TV first, online second, then print. Meaning that everything becomes convergent. In the nation, we have the convergent newsroom, and all the reporters, because of the struggle we have had in the past few years, fighting, arguing over whether we should adopt a technology or not, now they are convinced that to survive, you need to be paranoid. Only the paranoid survive. So we talk about losing jobs, we talk about people not reading our papers, but we don't stop. We say, hey, if fewer people read our newspapers, they'll watch our TV. They'll go online, they'll check our Twitter, they will go on Facebook to read our stories. So how do you change the mentality of the content producers, the professional ones in our case, to really take advantage of the technology? One great case, one day, a few years ago, if you remember, there was this picture of the plane that landed in Hudson River in New York. I took that picture and I had this briefing with all the reporters and said, you know, this picture was not taken by a professional photographer. It is one of the passengers or one of the passers-by who happened to be passing by and used the mobile phone, took a picture and put it on Twitter, and it went everywhere in the world. From now on, for us, there's no more a foreign story. Anything that happens anywhere in the world is within reach. It's on Twitter. You could check out his name, this guy who took the picture, call him on the phone, put him live on TV. This is not a story just for CNN or BBC anymore, because the mentality of us Asians still consider international story out of bound. It's not our job. We wait for CNN to cover, right? So the main thing is to change the mentality of the local reporters that the world is now so small that we can cover everything through technology, through social media. And once that wall is demolished, that mental wall is demolished, then we get our people who can go anywhere and cover the stories through social media, Skype, asking questions through Facebook, getting the new contacts, connections, going to other websites and get the stories. So we save a lot of money not doing the routine things anymore. We don't have beats anymore. We don't have government house beat, the education ministry beat anymore. These stories are in fact on Twitter and Facebook. So our people do premium content. I think that is the secret, that we can survive only if we provide content that is unique. That is, I think, one of the reasons why The Economist, Financial Times do well online.
Yep.
People are willing to pay for premium. People are not going to pay for general news, breaking news, things they can get from anywhere. So our solution to monetize is to produce premium content
Yeah.
and really manage your costs very, very strictly.
Fantastic. It is almost lunchtime. We'll take one question and then we will wrap it up.
Yeah, really quick. So I know we talked about the advantages of digital journalism. So with emerging countries, developing countries where internet is a problem penetration-wise, how can we start taking baby steps towards, actively seeking citizen journalists in our communities? Is there anything we can do to kind of jumpstart that movement once, when the internet penetration is good?
I'll talk the technology end of it, which is in our countries, and India and Pakistan being among the lowest in Asia in terms of internet penetration, we're going to hopscotch over that and just go straight to mobile.
Right.
So the Philippines, for example, has a 33 to 38%, depending on which telco you're talking to, internet penetration rate. But our Android growth is in the 300% every year and doubling. So we expect that by 2015, internet penetration rate can be, this is according to the Secretary of Science and Technology, DOST. He says 90% internet penetration, but they're not going through laptops. They're coming in through their mobile phones, where Facebook is free for anyone who has a phone that's
I think Myanmar is a good example. You
Myanmar.
don't have to go step by step like we
Right.
have gone through. So you leapfrog.
Exactly.
You go from very bad internet connection to mobile.
1% internet penetration rate in Myanmar, and
Yes.
then they expect in 2 years' time that they'll have 80% mobile penetration rate.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Gentlemen, let me just give you one key takeaway for each of the. Yes, please. One more question, and then I know you're hungry.
Thank you, Maria. I was shocked. I felt a good question. The question, does the crowd know better?
That's a great question.
I'm curious to know what the panelists have to say, starting from Singapore and why.
Oh, does the crowd know better? And I will piggyback on it. Do you trust the crowd?
Most of the time, the crowd here in Singapore will tell you that they do know better. But Twitter actually told us recently that the Straits Times Twitter feed is actually the #1 Twitter feed among all Singaporeans, and that's among 2.65 million Twitter users in Singapore. That's ahead of Taylor Swift, which shows you the sudden jump and extreme. So I think what I would say, my observation of the way trends are in Singapore is, yes, the crowd does know better at certain times. When it comes to disasters, riots, fires, or accidents, those things, yes, they would know better because they might be just passing by. But there are certain things that still need verification, and I think that's where you still ultimately want to check the news outlets, those that you trust, actually, because you're looking for some accuracy and reliability. So you can follow all your favorite citizen journalism feeds, but you will still check us. And I think that's the reason why the Singaporeans made us the #1 Twitter channel. That for that reason, you would then use it for different situations. You wouldn't use a crowd rumor, for example, to just broadcast a story. You need to do your verification checks. So this is the difference between us and someone sitting in the living room at home, being fed by the grandmother, and then just putting out stuff like that.
Yeah, I think crowdsourcing is important, but for journalists who are either working on the web or for television or newspapers, it can at best be treated as the first source of information on which you can build a story, but to take that as a story can be very dangerous for in many of the cases. There will be incidents where you don't have any correspondent in a remote village. You may have to rely on crowdsourcing, but then even while doing a story, you will have to qualify it in a way that you do not become a victim of some kind of rumor or scandal. In societies which are highly politicized, there is always a danger. For instance, a riot takes place. You have absolutely no idea who you are talking to, whether that person has a particular political view on what is happening in that street. He's pro-government, he's against the government, he is with one ethnic community or the other communal organization. So you have to be very careful, very skeptical about it. I'm talking about journalists. So it can come as the first source of information, but not the only source to do a story or report about it.
Right.
So my answer, which is horrible, would be yes and no. Now, it sounds like I'm a flip-flopper, but generally, yes, and to a certain extent, that the crowd knows better in terms of public opinion polls and so on. But the no would be, in our recent case of a missing jetliner, you have no idea how many areas we got feedback on where to look for a plane. And trust me, I don't think that was very useful. And if you fact check every one of them, seriously, it was none of the above. And to this day, we still don't know where it is. So yes and no, that has to be my answer to that.
Suthichai.
Yes, very brief. The crowd is very valuable, but listen, watch, but verify.
And for me, it is the hope for the future. In terms of Philippine democracy, again, I will tell you the negatives, like the journalists did, right? The negative is that negative emotion spreads fastest of anything, fastest and furthest. And there are academic studies that were done in the United States that verified a lot of the same things we're seeing in our mood meters. But in a country like the Philippines, where we have elite feudalistic politics, and I'm not a leftist necessarily, but it's the power structures in some of the developing democracies really will benefit from having the crowd come up. My hope comes from them. And on that note, I will turn it back to Epi and Hope to lunch. Thank you, gentlemen.